Gentlemen, welcome to our channel. If you, like me, do not support adultery and believes that cheaters should be fully responsible for their actions, then like this video and do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Well, let's get started. I am currently 27 years old and my wife is 26. Our life together began 10 years ago when we met during our school years. We first met in the year 2012 when I was 17 and she was 16. Before the beginning of our relationship, I had only one person, just like my wife never had a boyfriend. This means that we both went on a romantic trip without having enough experience. Despite our young age, we dated for 4 years before we decided to tie the knot. I knew perfectly well that our path would not be without obstacles. My wife has experienced a turbulent upbringing characterized by an unstable family environment and the lingering effects of substance abuse. That's why I became a beacon of positivity in her life. Even during her school years, she spent several days with me, and her parents seemed indifferent to her daughter's absence from home. Fortunately, my parents understood the depth of our love for each other and from the very beginning accepted her as a dear member of our family. I consider myself very lucky that my parents have provided me with unwavering support at every step. When I introduced my future wife to them, they took the situation with an open heart and an open soul. Both my parents come from modest families. My father, at the age of 52, has been working as a production manager at a local car factory for more than 3 decades. My mother, who is 48 years old, works as a nurse. In their spacious 5-bedroom house, there was enough space for me and my 2 older siblings, so my parents were glad of her presence. They devoted their time to truly understand and establish a relationship with my future wife. Knowing about the problems her own parents faced and the negative impact it had on her life, my parents warmly welcomed her into our family. They created a safe and affectionate environment for her that she had never encountered before. Their acceptance and warmth gave her a deep sense of belonging and stability. On her 20th birthday, she gave birth to our first son. The following year, we tied the knot and settled in our own house, conveniently located next to my parents. Despite our independence, our parents insisted that we live with them, as it was important for them to be near their beloved grandson. Since all my siblings had moved away, our spacious 5-bedroom house seemed like a complete castle. Shortly after graduating from college, I got a job as a design engineer. Despite the fact that my wife received a higher pedagogical education, we decided that she would become a mother without leaving home in order to give priority to taking care of our growing family. To reduce the financial burden, my parents decided to move from a 5-bedroom house to a more comfortable 3-bedroom home. Although my brothers and sisters, nephews and nieces visit us only on holidays, life knows how to throw unexpected obstacles at us, putting our determination and honesty to the test. As for me, these difficulties have played a significant role in shaping my character. At the age of 24, a number of sad events occurred in my life. It all started with the fact that my wife was expecting her 3rd child, but tragedy struck when I was in a motorcycle accident with a near-fatal outcome. This case was the beginning of a turbulent period when I delved into the history of my accident, went through months of hard recovery in the hospital, coped with the loss of income, faced a huge financial burden, because of which my wife and child were forced to seek support from my parents. Against the background of all these difficulties, the most heartbreaking discovery was that my wife was gradually losing her attachment to our relationship. When my stay in the hospital was coming to an end, I could not get rid of the feeling that my mother was the only person to whom I was truly dear. Riding a motorcycle symbolized freedom in my life, served as an escape from everyday routine. On weekends, I went on exciting trips with my friends. Although my parents were against it, especially my mother, for security reasons, my wife and I treasured it as a means of rapprochement and indulgence of our common passion. On that autumn day, the air was crisp, which created the perfect setting for my motorcycle adventure. When I got on the motorcycle, wanting to take a little break from the hardships of life, I was grateful that my wife, who was 8 months pregnant, was not riding with me. Not knowing what to do, a fleeting distraction will lead to chaos in my existence as I make my way through the noisy traffic. In an instant, A collision with another car threw me into the air and I collapsed onto the unforgiving asphalt with a force that shattered my bones. The agony and loss of consciousness that followed served as a brutal awakening to a new reality. When my consciousness awoke, a bright world of infinite possibilities opened before my eyes, replacing the clinical framework of a hospital ward. The scale of my trauma materialized, revealing a tapestry of shattered bones, hidden internal bleeding, and an overwhelming sense of physical fragility that limited me from the compassionate care of qualified healers. Gratitude overwhelmed me when I realized that my loved ones are with me, who provide me with constant support. In particular, my mother courageously took precious minutes out of her busy work schedule with unfailing devotion to be near me. At the same time, my beloved wife, torn between her devotion to me and the responsibilities that await her at home, made frequent trips between the two worlds so that our connection would remain inseparable. She took care of our 2 children on her shoulders, as well as pregnancy at the 8th month. As time passed, days turned into weeks, then into months. I underwent surgery and underwent heavy rehabilitation courses with an unwavering determination to regain mobility and independence. While my body was struggling to recover, the burden of financial obligations became more and more obvious. A long stay in the hospital led to a significant loss of income, which increased the already overwhelming feeling of uncertainty and instability in my life. Nevertheless, I persevered on my way to recovery. After the birth of my daughter, my wife began to count on the financial support of my parents. The additional responsibility for a growing family, combined with the lack of funds in case of unforeseen circumstances, only made my situation worse. When all the insurance money went to pay medical bills, I was unable to pay the mortgage. The harsh reality of our financial difficulties made me feel inferior and powerless, and my wife and 3 children were forced to seek shelter with my parents. The weight of the consequences of my accident has fallen on all of us. After a long stay in the hospital and subsequent financial difficulties, our relationship suffered from the effects of childbirth. We became emotionally detached from each other as the tension made itself felt. His wife's visits were reduced to twice a week, and even then she took only the children with her. But the sight of the children during these visits brought me great joy and greatly helped my recovery. During this difficult time, my mother remained unchanged and visited me daily, providing much-needed stability. Since all the financial burden fell on my father's shoulders, our family found itself in a difficult situation. In addition, I was pleased that both my mother and my wife were with me during my stay in the hospital. At first, I didn't worry when my wife didn't show up as often as expected, believing that this was due to her responsibilities towards our growing family. I was looking forward to being discharged from the hospital, wanting to return home and join the happiness of our growing family. But as time went on, it became more and more obvious that my wife's visits had significantly decreased, and her concern for my recovery had decreased. At that moment, I did not understand the reasons for her absence, believing that it was due solely to the enormous stress and unbearable responsibilities that she carried outside the hospital. I admitted that she had to manage financial affairs alone, take care of a newborn, and withstand the emotional stress caused by my accident and subsequent hospitalization. There was no doubt that all these hardships would inevitably affect her. Nevertheless, as the days turned into weeks, her absence became more and more noticeable, and I wondered more and more often, what was the catalyst for such a change in her behavior? I was so absorbed in my own recovery that I didn't understand the underlying reasons for the decrease in the number of her visits. It was only later that I realized what the problem was. The long separation has led to a noticeable gap between us, both physical and emotional. Being a mama's boy, I always relied on my mother's presence and assumed that my wife was absent because she knew that my mother would be there for me. Despite the fact that I knew that my father was providing me with financial support, I was often interested in my wife's financial well-being because I felt powerless without being a breadwinner. My mother constantly reminded me that my father provides us with everything we need. I believed that the responsibility of taking care of our extended family affected her emotional state, and she had little time and energy left to support my recovery. After 7 months spent in the hospital, the moment came when I was able to return home. But I quickly discovered that the obstacles I faced were not only related to my physical recovery, the emotional impact of the accident, and the subsequent tension in our relationship left an indelible imprint on our intimate life. It was difficult for me to reconnect with my wife. The deep suffering and limitations imposed by the trauma had a strong impact on my unwillingness to participate in intimate contacts. The fear of opening wounds or experiencing any discomfort has become an insurmountable obstacle preventing me from sincerely accepting physical intimacy with my beloved wife. The ghost of the accident continued to haunt my thoughts, generating a deep fragility that prevented me from truly being present in those cherished moments. After being discharged from the hospital, I returned to work in just 2 weeks. Although it was still difficult for me to walk long distances and move awkwardly due to constant physical therapy, my mental abilities remained at the same level. Fortunately, my colleagues at work were glad to see me back. Gradually recovering from the accident and recovery, I began to notice a new obstacle in my relationship with my wife. It seemed that she wanted to move out of my parents' house, which, in my opinion, could be the cause of this problem. Watching the growing tension between mother and wife, I began to worry. When I returned to my parents' house, I realized that my wife's involvement in the lives of our children was not as great as it seemed to me before. Despite the fact that my mother devoted herself to caring for me in the hospital, she continued to return home to take care of our children and perform her work duties. It is not surprising that this situation led to a serious conflict between my mother and my wife. Trying to relieve tension, I found it necessary to allocate a separate room to my wife, which she could consider her own. Unfortunately, the relationship between my mom and my wife has reached the point of irreparable destruction. Before I got into the accident, they had a close relationship resembling that of a mother and daughter. But after my return from the hospital, their communication began to be filled with constant quarrels. This situation was very upsetting to my parents. In this regard, we decided to move to a new apartment. It was during this move that I began to notice that an emotional distance was growing between me and my wife. She began to look more and more distant, preoccupied, and constantly busy with her phone. This sense of separation weighed heavily on me at that time. There was one question that bothered me throughout my recovery. During the intimacy, I felt a certain detachment from her, as if our intimate moments were just a task for her that she had to complete, and she couldn't wait for them to end. Perhaps this was due to the fact that I had not yet fully restored my emotional connection with my body, since my recovery was not yet complete. In the past, I usually took the initiative in the bedroom during intimacy, while she was not inclined to take responsibility or take any active part. This made me think that it would take a lot of time to fully restore our intimate relationship. Over time, it became clear that there was a deeper problem here. Her constant attachment to the phone, as well as her unwillingness to have meaningful conversations and spend time together, left me alone and caused anxiety about the state of our relationship. The lack of honesty and open dialogue in our daily communication increased my insecurity and gradually destroyed the trust between us. There were doubts that made me think about whether there is a more significant factor here, whether something else is happening. I came to a startling realization of the state of our marriage, our emotional detachment, and the wife's constant preoccupation with her phone. It dawned on me that this could be our reality, at least until I fully recover. Previously, it gave me great pleasure to watch her joy and contentment during lovemaking. But when I noticed her absence and lack of participation, my own interest began to fade, and our relationship gradually turned into a relationship of just roommates. The severity of my wife's disinterest in our relationship, combined with the difficulties associated with my recovery from the accident, gradually plunged me into depression. I was overcome by a feeling of great sadness, despair, and isolation, which prevented me from living. Children and work were the only sources of joy in my life, as I gradually lost interest in intimacy. I believed that my relationship with my wife surpassed intimacy. We were friends long before we became romantic partners, and I believed that our relationship would last. But everything changed one fateful day when my mother, with whom I often talked, called and expressed her suspicions about my father's infidelity. Since my father and I work at the same factory, my mother asked me if he was always at work. I replied that I wasn't sure because I rarely see him there. Since I spend most of my time in the office, I don't run into him that often, unless we happen to meet or plan to have lunch together. Then she asked if my father had any attractive female subordinates. I answered hesitantly because I didn't pay attention to his direct subordinates and had no reason to know. Underestimating my mom's fears and dismissing them as paranoia was a serious mistake on my part, which I deeply regret. I did not take into account her experiences and the problems she faced, and for this I am sincerely ashamed. To my surprise, returning home in the evening, my wife and I found humor in this situation. We didn't know yet that everything would change in a month. In a phone conversation, my mother confessed to me that she bought a GPS tracker a few weeks ago. Shockingly, it turned out that the father does not devote as much time to work as he claimed and often visits budget motels. At that moment, reality hit me hard. I trusted her words, but decided not to tell my wife about it, as it was too serious a matter to treat it lightly. The consequences could ruin my parents' marriage if it turned out that my father was unfaithful. When I came to work, I quietly inquired about my father's work schedule and found out that he does not devote as much time to her as he claims. Having received this information, I was going to discuss it with my brothers and sisters, hoping that we could turn to my father together before the situation worsened. It was very important to approach this issue delicately, as a peaceful resolution of the situation was extremely important. My parents decided to separate at this stage of their lives, despite all the difficulties they faced together. Shortly after my mother informed me about the GPS installed in my father's car, she called me to tell me that she noticed a pattern in the fact that he visits a certain hotel at a certain time. Worried, she asked me to go with her to meet him at the hotel. Despite being busy at work, I immediately put everything on hold to join her, hoping to diffuse the situation and prevent further escalation. Such collisions can be dangerous, and I sincerely worry about the safety of my mother or everyone involved in them. When we arrived at the hotel, each in his own car, I noticed my father's car parked in the parking lot. Mom, who had already arrived, was patiently waiting for me in the hall. How she found out the number of the room where my father was staying, I can't say for sure. Perhaps she asked the receptionist or someone she knew. However, such details did not occupy my attention. All I knew was that I had made it to the lobby. At my mother's insistence, we went to room 256, the supposed place of residence of my father and his mistress. While we were walking to the elevator, an unusual meeting took place between my mother and the cleaner. Their exchange of opinions seemed strangely familiar to me, and I was at a loss when the woman joined us in the elevator. Is it possible that my mother used the services of this hotel employee? Or maybe this so-called hostess was just masquerading as her? The whole situation resembled a premeditated plan. Feeling all the doubtfulness of what was happening, I cautiously offered my mother a more reasonable course of action. At first, my mother and I were asked to wait in the hall, but she refused. Standing at door 556, we positioned ourselves so that we could not be seen through the peephole. The cleaner knocked on the door and announced herself as a cleaner. At that moment, I heard my father's voice coming from room 256. He firmly replied that he refused the services of a cleaner. But the persistent housekeeper continued to discuss the payment for the call, not wanting to let him go. The disappointment in her father's voice was obvious, and eventually he got tired of her insistence. He decided to open the door. To reveal her intentions, we rushed into the room with the determination of law enforcement agencies, forcing Mom and me to make a loud entrance. The father collapsed on the floor in fright. It was important for Mom to reveal the identity of the woman, and we were surprised to see her trying to hide under the blanket. As soon as my mom and I entered the room, our world collapsed when we saw my father and my wife together. We were shocked and speechless. My father continued to pace restlessly, raising both hands above his head, leaving us in complete silence. I was completely confused and disoriented. She was lying, my wife, hidden under the blankets, as if we didn't notice her presence. Arriving at the hotel with the intention of preventing my mother from taking out her anger on another woman and my father, I suddenly felt weak and depressed, which forced me to leave the room in search of a breath of fresh air. When I went out, I could hear the echoes of my mother's threats against my wife and father. Finding peace in the corridor, I sank into the seat, trying to comprehend the deep suffering that had just unfolded before my eyes. The revelation was excruciatingly painful. The shattered illusion of a stable and loving family continues to haunt me, traumatizing me to this day. The betrayal on the part of my father and wife deeply pierced my heart. I still distinctly remember my mother pulling my wife away from the bed in tears, but I was too numb to fully realize what was happening. It seemed to me that my world was collapsing, and I felt an irresistible desire to cease to exist. The future seemed bleak, and I realized that life would never be the same again. Despite all the instincts that prompted me to leave the hotel and leave, I could not leave my mother. Anger was not my immediate emotion. Instead, I was gripped by a deep sense of betrayal. I felt completely drained and exhausted. My father desperately called my name, begged for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye. I understood that I had to stay strong for Mom's sake. The news we have just received will undoubtedly cause her great pain. With great effort, I persuaded my mother to let go of my wife's grip, and together we left the hotel, leaving my mother in tears. I walked my mom home, where her crying didn't seem to stop. Her anxiety was growing, and she resorted to taking medication to relax. Soon, she fell into a deep sleep on the sofa in the living room. The day was, to put it mildly, incredibly tiring. It was my responsibility to pick up the children from kindergarten, as I could not rely on my wife. She was upset after the incident with my mother at the hotel. Before leaving, I made sure to inform my two brothers and sisters about the situation and asked them to book tickets for the earliest flight home. Our family was in an unprecedented crisis, which turned out to be irreparable. The only source of strength that kept me moving forward was the well-being of my children. I picked them up from kindergarten and brought them home after learning that she had left them there so that she would have some time for herself. I decided to give preference to my mother's well-being when I received numerous apologies from my wife in a long text message. Instead of reading it, I decided to focus on work, as is usually the case in times of crisis. But this time I felt I had to ensure my mother's safety, so I took a break from work and stayed at home with her. When my brothers and sisters returned to the city, my father was able to return home. Unfortunately, I was not present at their meeting with him because I could not be in the same room with him. In my eyes, he is no longer a part of my life. It was very important for each member of our family to handle this situation in their own way. Personal well-being came to the fore. The consequences of this revelation were emotionally and mentally strong, which led to feelings of betrayal, anger, and self-doubt. Accepting the fact that our family will never be the same turned out to be an incredibly difficult path. I had to come to terms with the loss of both my wife and father. The idyllic image of a united and friendly family was completely destroyed. Finally, 3 days after the day of discovery, my wife returned home. We sat together, trying to be polite. In an attempt to deal with the upcoming path, it is important to recognize the circumstances of the current situation. She admits that the affair began shortly after the birth, during my stay in the hospital. She explains this by the fact that she had a huge responsibility to take care of all the children, and the exceptional support of my father brought them closer together. She claims that he made her feel indebted to him, especially when my mother was with me in the hospital. One evening, when they were watching TV together, the situation suddenly escalated. They continued to meet secretly until they felt that my mother was beginning to suspect something. There seemed to be a shift in dynamics between them, which was probably caused by some deep tension. My mother, as always astute, felt that my wife was a threat. When we moved out of my parents' house and settled in our own apartment, I was busy with work most of the time and therefore did not notice that my wife was having an affair with my own father. But my mother was not blind to the truth. It was at this time that she began to suspect my father of infidelity. Unfortunately, not all stories have a happy ending, and this one was no exception. When I talked to my wife about her actions, I decided to be honest and straightforward. I informed her of my decision to divorce, to make sure of my mother's well-being, and to ensure my father's departure from home. My brothers and sisters came to the city. It is obvious that my father's actions destroyed our family. leaving no opportunity to return to the old life. About 9 months have passed since the day everything collapsed, and I have successfully completed the divorce process with my wife. But my parents' divorce is delayed due to the complicated division of property acquired in marriage. Although I understand that hatred is a strong emotion, it accurately describes the strong feelings that my mother and I have towards my father. I don't engage in any conversations with him when we accidentally cross paths at work. He has no meaning in my life anymore. After our separation, my ex-wife returned to teaching, and now we have equal rights to custody of our children. The accident I got into on a motorcycle continues to have an impact on me, and it is unlikely that I will ever fully recover both mentally and physically. Part of me was left on the side of the road, and the other part was lost in the hotel. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that despite the huge losses caused by this accident, I continue to live for the sake of my children and my mother. And my father and my ex-wife decided to live together. Fortunately, her father convinced her that it was better to leave the children to live with me and my mother so that they would have more time for each other. And I was glad of this decision, because besides my mother, there is no one who will raise my children better. I worked a lot, my mom took care of my children and the house, while my ex-wife and father were having fun. But out of happiness, it didn't last long. While on vacation abroad, they got into a terrible plane crash, and during a collision, their car flew off a mountain serpentine. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they both died. Apparently, karma befell them both, preventing them from enjoying happiness, while my mother and I suffered from their betrayal.